And hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters on Armstrong. Chapters is the television show that profiles local authors, editors, and publishers in our community. I'm Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. Our guest today is author Bob Yoho, and Bob Yoho was born in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and while he was still a child, his parents moved the family to a cattle farm in southeastern Ohio. Now, Bob has been employed in manufacturing for almost 30 years, and at the same time, he worked as a freelance writer for years in many fields such as politics and sports. In addition, he's also hosted a weekly radio talk show for over 4 years, and his love of Westerns began with the reading of Flint, a novel by famed Western author Louis L. Armour. And as he continues to write, he is a devoted husband, father, and grandfather, and he's also a devoted fan of West Virginia University football and basketball. And we're just delighted to have him with us today. Bob Yoho, welcome to Chapters. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Eliot. I'm glad to be here.
Let me ask you a little bit about you as a writer and how you got started writing and why Westerns.
Well, I actually made that's kind of a long story. My dad used to read Westerns, and I made fun of him for years and years. I kind of joked about it, and you're reading them dime store novels, and I kind of made fun of him. And then one of these days, I decided, I ought to see what he's reading. So I pulled one out of his lunch bucket. He worked at a chemical plant too, and I pulled one out. And it was Flint by Louis L'Amour, and I thought, I'll just read that. And I read it, and I kind of liked it. And I thought, I read about every other book Louis L'Amour wrote before I was done, and then somewhere along the way, I kind of decided, I thought, well, Louis L'Amour isn't going to live forever, so maybe who's going to write books when he's gone? So I thought, well, why not me? And this kind of how it ended up.
Let me ask you a little bit about Westerns sort of as a genre. And why do you think they're so popular today? I mean, we turn on television, for example, we still see old episodes of Bonanza being shown. We still see old episodes of Gunsmoke starring James Arness as Matt Dillon being shown. What is it about Westerns you think that as time goes on and as we get farther and farther removed away from that time period where Westerns often take place, people still get interested in those and still want to read about those?
Well, we kind of got away from it there from when I was a child to now, and they just kind of come back. We kind of went to space with Star Wars and things such as that, Star Trek, and it seemed like we made a transition back to the Western. And I think sometimes, possibly as times get tougher, I think people look for something old, something familiar, something that they're used to. Over 400,000 people made their way west on the Oregon Trail, farmers, ranchers, businessmen, and they say the footprints of them and the hoof prints of those settlers going west on the Oregon Trail, they're still there today. You can still see them. Well, those prints not only marked out our landscape, they also marked our character, and I think that's part of the popularity of the Western, possibly why it's coming back.
Let me ask you a little bit about writing Westerns, and then we'll get into some of your books specifically. When you sit down to write a Western, what are some of the things that you have to think of as a writer? Because you are stepping back in time to some degree, and you're moving into a landscape that maybe people from this area aren't as familiar with. What are some considerations you as the writer have to take when you get ready to plot out and start drafting a Western?
Well, probably one of the big things you have to be aware of all the time. I'm convinced you've got to realize that the landscape, the environment, is a character in your novel, same as the people you're writing about. And I think character and environment, the kind of land they lived in, that's a character in your novels. And I think if you're going to write a good one, you need to realize that. And I think along with it, you have to have a respect for the time and the time period. And if you don't have that respect, I think that'll come out in your books too.
I want to ask you and talk a little bit about one of your first Westerns, and this I think actually is your first Western, was Long Ride to Yesterday. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that stood out to me in reading that is just like a Western, just like one of those episodes of Bonanza we were talking about, it was a very concise, sort of tightly written story that was really interesting. But you had a main character there named Gain Carson, and he reminded me a lot of those old Western kind of heroes that we as a reader can galvanize behind and really follow through the story. Can you talk to us a little bit about creating this Gain Carson character and why he's such a great character?
Gain Carson, I I had in mind an older gentleman, somebody pretty old for the period of time. I paced him about 65. At that time, that was fairly old. As I get older, I'm starting to think 65 isn't all that old anymore. But in that time period, it probably was. And the character I wanted to write there was a little bit crusty. He was kind of a talker, kind of a saddleback philosopher along with it. And that kind of came out in the story. And actually, the horse he rode was as much a part of the character of that story as he was in some ways. But I had a lot of fun with that. And there's a lot of humor in that book. And it's probably lighter than the other westerns I've written.
When you set him up as a character, I love how you mentioned that he's the sort of the crusty kind of character. Was that something in making him older that made him unique? He wasn't sort of the young, handsome 35-year-old, Matt Dillon or some other, Roy Rogers or some other type of Western hero we knew. Is that one of the things that you think makes him kind of a special character? Is his age and sort of that curmudgeonly
Yeah,
nature
I
he
kind of
has?
like that. I mean, I like the fact that he's sort of what they might around here refer to as old codgers, and as I get older, that's being, that term is starting to appeal to me more all the time, and I kind of like the guy that, personally, I think the guy that if it was ever in a movie, I mean, the guy that would be perfect to play that would be a character like Robert Duvall. I mean, great actor, plays that kind of role perfectly, but that would be the kind of character I probably had in mind when I wrote that.
Let me ask you a little bit about your writing process in general, and we'll talk about your Major Harris book here in just a second, which is away from the Western genre. But how do you go about writing? What is your process? Is it something you do every day? Do you do it sporadically? And how do you get from an idea that you want to write about through the drafting process?
Well, I generally start books with a premise. Now, I do most of them. I start with the Westerns. I pretty well end up with the Westerns. I've done a little nonfiction along the way, too. But I try to, I don't write every day. It's hard to do with my work schedule and things, but I go pretty hard. My books tend to be pretty hard for me till I get past about 80 pages. The start of them's easy. Everything up to about 80 pages is rather difficult, and it seems like once I get there, I'll be honest with you, I can smell blood in the water, and I just want to get that thing done. And occasionally my wife has to remind me that I'm still married, I still have responsibilities around the house, and so she has to bring me back to reality. But I know people that struggle to finish books. I struggle to start them, and I'm good at finishing what I start. I almost get compelled to finish, and when I get close to a book, sometimes I don't know how they're going to turn out, and I kind of want to find out too.
Sure, absolutely. It would seem to me that Westerns are a little bit like science fiction in terms of, because you're taking to some degree readers to a time and a place maybe that they can't identify with it, that you do have to spend a lot of time in those early pages kind of world building and scene building.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that's so important to make that scene a character in and of itself. Is that something that slows down the process a little bit when you have to scene build, or is it more plot that can slow you down when you're trying to get into something that you're writing?
I find that all of it's an all part of it, and I tell you the truth, I enjoy all of it. I mean, when I first started writing, I hated writing dialogue, and of course it showed. I wasn't very good, but dialogue's something I've really come to enjoy. But the setting, the scenes of it just seems pretty natural in a Western. But it is a different kind of writing. What's interesting about the Western, it's America's only unique form of literature. Every other kind of literature, mysteries, romance, everything else that started, even science fiction, everything else we got started somewhere else. The Western is unique to America, and it makes it pretty special in some ways.
I wanted to ask you, too, about another character that you developed over several books, and that is Kellen Malone. You have a series of Westerns around Kellen Malone, and he's a great character. I enjoyed reading him, and especially in the book Death Comes to Red Hawk. Can you talk a little bit about Kellen Malone and that book in particular, Death Comes to Red Hawk?
Kellen Malone he wouldn't be so much like the Gang Carson character. He's more the younger, probably good-looking fella that you come to expect in a lot of books. But he's a reoccurring character in several of my books, and I've written a series around him. But Kellen Malone starts out really in the first book. He's been in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He's released from Yuma Territorial Prison. He gets out, and he wants to get his ranch back. He wants to get his reputation back. He wants to get his son back. And along the way, he's a bitter and hateful man, and he plans revenge. And this book's sort of a redemption. And as I come along, it's got some interesting turns and twists to it, I think, about what happens with his character. And I love this character. And the truth is, it's kind of interesting writing a series because you don't have to reveal everything about them all in one book. You just kind of release more and more over time. And it's a lot of fun writing a series. It's interesting.
I was going to ask you a little bit about that, about writing a series and sort of keeping this Kellen Malone character over the course of several books. Are there any challenges that come with that? I mean, as you mentioned, you don't really have to describe a whole lot about him, early on in that first book. But are any challenges in taking a character like a Kellen Malone and taking him through several books?
Well, I think at some point, and I don't know what point that is, but I think at some point, you're going to run out. The well runs dry on it, and I've got some fans of this character, and I think the biggest danger is doing away with him or stopping the books. I have one person in particular that asked me, "Hey, when am I going to get another Kellen Malone book?" And that's kind of fun as a writer to hear people say that. But I try to make his books. I try to start him out all the time doing something. I mean, when he starts out in a book, I try to grab your attention and have something happening right off the bat, and that's probably the biggest challenge, to come up with something new and creative all the time.
Let me ask you about any westerns that you're working on now. I know we talked before we started taping today about one western that you've sent off to press. Can you tell us a little bit about that book and maybe anything else that you're working on right now?
This book that I've got coming out probably in mid-March, Eliot, is called The Evil Day, and it's probably the darkest book I've ever written or probably ever attempt to write. In some ways, it's something of a mystery and a thriller along with it, and that's the cool thing about a Western, I think. In so many ways, Westerns can encompass so many different genres of writing. They can even go science fiction. Western can be a romance, it can be a thriller, it can be science fiction, it can be just about anything. But this book tends to be more of a mystery and more of a thriller type book. In that book, Kellen Malone is actually chasing an Old West version of a serial killer. And to be quite honest with you, I've never written anything quite that dark, and I've never actually read anything quite like this. This is a completely little bit of a departure for me. It was probably the most difficult Western I've ever penned. And so actually the next one I'm looking to have a little bit more fun with it and maybe make it a little lighter, because that was a little deep at times.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that's one thing that a lot of our writers have said, but anybody that does any kind of writing over a sustained period of time, sometimes you can be taken as a writer into those dark places. And you finish that chapter, you finish that scene, and you think, oh my goodness, you feel like you need to take a bath or something, or you need to go turn the light on because you need to get out of the darkness that you've been in for so long.
I mean, you got to kind of put yourself in the mind of some of these characters, and sometimes it's minds you don't really want to spend a lot of time in. I don't know how guys could write science fiction all the time. I don't know if I could do it.
Yeah, I think it would be the most challenging genre. Let me ask you about Kellen Malone, because I love him as a character. I'm one of those fans of Kellen Malone, and I like Lobo the dog. I liked him. I liked the kid Jesse. I liked Jesse that was in Death Comes to Red Hawk. I liked them all. Loved the book.
Well, thank you.
But I wanted to ask you, and you mentioned that eventually someday you'll run out of gas a little bit with Kellen Malone. Do you see the sun setting on him as a character, or do you feel like you've got a little bit longer you can go with him, more stories to tell with him?
No, I've got more to tell. I've actually got a reoccurring character I wrote in my book Nightfall Over Nicodemus, And I actually wrote a female character in there, and I really just planned for her to be there for a little bit, and she wouldn't go away, and her part just kept growing, and actually she appears in this next book too, and there has to be some resolution of her character and actually her hatred for Kellen Malone. So there's several more books in the well yet, and I'm actually thinking about doing a book in particular about Jesse Malone in particular, maybe a book just specifically dealing with him. But I have a lot of fun with these characters, and along with Kellen Malone is his best friend, a guy named Joe Clements, also known as Skull Clements, and he's an interesting character. And to be quite honest with you, probably somewhat of the inspiration for those characters is from a series of mysteries by Robert B. Parker, that was a Spencer and Hawk series, that Mr. Parker wrote, and I truly enjoyed those. I'm kind of a Jesse Stone fan, another series he wrote, and so this one guy on one side of the law, Kellen Malone, and the man that kind of skirts the other edge of the law is Joe Clements, and I kind of like that interplay there, and it makes for an interesting story and gives a lot to tell.
In addition to writing Westerns, you have authored a book on Major Harris, who was an outstanding quarterback for West Virginia in the late 80s, and a lot of fans will remember, and a lot of folks that follow college football will remember the famous 1988 national championship game against Notre Dame where Major Harris gets hurt, and as a result, Notre Dame goes on to win the national championship. But he was such a dynamic player, and I think when we look at quarterbacks like RG3, Robert Griffin III, we look at Donovan McNabb and those kinds of quarterbacks. Although Harris didn't play in the NFL, he really was kind of that first scrambling, mobile quarterback that could do a lot of things. Why were you interested in writing a book about Major Harris?
Well, I was a fan, obviously, as you said, I'm a devoted West Virginia fan. My dad and I was sitting in the stands there in Mountaineer Field when Major beat Penn State that year, and anybody that was there will never forget it. And I was a big fan of his, and as far as I knew, there'd never been a book written on him. And I just thought, pretty much like I do everything else, I think, why not me? And so I spent about a 2-year pursuit trying to write this. But Major Harris obviously was years ahead of his time. He's the kind of quarterback he'd probably look for now, and the man was really a forerunner of many of the quarterbacks we see today. He was a little before his time though, and changed the game in a lot of ways.
I know that writing about people always provides different challenges than writing something totally fiction when you're making up characters that don't actually exist. How much time did you spend with Major Harris, and what were some of the things you had to keep in mind as you sat down to write the draft sort of his life and his career? What were some of the challenges that came from that?
Well, you want to get the story right, for one, and actually I probably had 2 or 3 personal visits along with probably about 30 hours of phone conversations. And I had never written a full biography. Actually, the first book I ever published was a series of biographies of World War II vets, but I'd never actually written a full biography. And when I actually got the okay to write it, I actually wondered if I wasn't biting off more than I could chew. But it's a lot of challenge, and it requires more working with someone than just, I'm in my own world here. Whatever world there is in the fiction novels and the westerns, I create, and I make the characters. I can make them go away, and sometimes they won't go away. But my wife says the voices are talking to me again. But,
that's right.
But there's a lot of challenges they're doing that, and it's a lot of effort. And you want to get the man's story right, but you also want to create a story they'd be pleased with too along the way.
What was some of the feedback you got when that book first came out, both from Major and from WVU fans, whom I assume were interested in that and probably bought several copies of that book?
That's probably one of the best kept secrets in the state of West Virginia is that book. It's in my opinion, one of the best sports biographies nobody ever read. and I like that book, and the people. I had some misconceptions about where he was drafted and what happened to him after the draft, and actually I just tried to write the questions that every West Virginia fan had about it, and maybe correct some misconceptions people had as well.
So when you think about biographies, is that something you're thinking about in addition to westerns? maybe dabbling in again, maybe picking another athlete or somebody else from maybe West Virginia history or national history? Is there another biography you've got in mind of someone you'd like to focus on?
Yeah, I've always kind of thought about trying to write Pat White's autobiography, and I was kind of waiting to see where his NFL career would go, and that may not all be told yet, but I've considered that and maybe a couple others, but I just kind of wait to see what inspires me. I kind of chase whatever I'm interested in at the time.
And Bob, I know as we finish up with you here today, we want to give you a moment to maybe pick a passage or read something from one of your books, one of your westerns for our audience that maybe would like to get a taste of some of the great writing that you have in your westerns. So we'll let you do that here in just a second, and then we'll give folks an opportunity to find out where they can get copies of your westerns or the Major Harris book if they're interested. So we'll let you pick a passage, something that you'd like to read from one of your books, and just give us maybe a brief description of where we are, what book this is, and what may be going on as you prepare to read that passage to us.
The book I'd probably read a little bit out of be Death Comes to Red Hawk, and to be quite honest with you, the first sentence in this book is probably one of my favorite sentences of anything I ever wrote. But it starts out with Kellen Malone. Obviously, this is a book where really starts a series about Kellen Malone, and I be honest with you, I like this sentence for all it says, but it was probably one of my favorite things I ever wrote. But so I'll just give it a little try here.
Sure, that'd be fun.
The night was a sleeping child, peaceful, serene, but loaded with the promise of a loud awakening, and needful of attention when it did. The broad-shouldered man slept peacefully, his head resting on his saddlebags. It was the first truly restful sleep Kellen Malone had known in years, on this, his first night outside Yuma Territorial Prison. 7 long years of sweat and toil were now behind him, leaving only calloused hands, a scar-covered back, and his precious dreams of revenge. Malone had spent 35 years in life's schoolroom, and experience had clearly been a stern teacher. The hopes he once shared with Alice Malone were now as faded as the jeans he wore, and his chaps were as battered as Malone's hope for the future. His face was burned dark from breaking rocks in the relentless Arizona sun and from the Indian blood that coursed through his veins. His mother had been a full-blooded Cherokee, his father a white trapper who took her away from the reservation. She survived the cruelties of the white man's government, but died giving birth to her son. The unmistakable sound of a drawn-back pistol hammer broke the stillness of the wet desert morning. Malone's brown eyes were instantly alert, and he cursed himself for sleeping so soundly. Instinctively, Malone's hand went toward his gun. "I wouldn't do that, Malone."
Oh, very nice, very nice. And that is a great book. I love that book. And
Thank you.
And I can be, as a fan of Kellen Malone, please keep more Kellen Malone books coming. I love his character and all of the sidekicks and all the people he gets involved with. It's fantastic. So, Bob, if someone's interested in getting a copy of one of your Westerns or the Major Harris book or getting in contact with you personally, how can they do that?
Oh, you can go to, I have a website, it's rgyoho.com, or you can look me up under Amazon. You'll find it there. Actually, at my website, I actually have a link to my my books. It'll take you to Amazon where you can purchase them. They're also available in Barnes & Noble. I'm sure this store here, Empire Books, could get you one if you wanted to. And I just thank everybody that reads them. I have a lot of fun writing them. I hope I can keep bringing them to you.
And we wish you all the success and the best of luck in your future writing. Bob Yoho, thank you so much for being on Chapters with us today. And we also want to take a moment to say thanks to our partners at Empire Books and News here at Pullman Square in downtown Huntington for providing our set location for taping this episode of Chapters. We invite you to stop by Empire Books and News anytime you need to find something to read. They have the Tri-State's largest selection of magazines, plus they have a lot of the writers that we have featured on Chapters. You can find their books here, so we invite you to stop by and check that out. But if you have a little one at home, if you like to read different kind of genres and different age groups, everything you need to read for the picky reader or the voracious reader, you can find it right here at Empire Books and News at Pullman Square. And we certainly appreciate them letting us use their facilities for taping this episode of Chapters. And finally, if you have a question, comment, or story suggestion about this Chapters program or any Chapters program that you've seen, here on Armstrong and Time Warner Cable. We certainly would like to hear from you. You can send us an email to the address at the bottom of your screen. It's the letter L, letter P, number 4, LP4, at zoominternet.net. We certainly appreciate all the feedback that we get from you, and so please keep those emails coming. We certainly appreciate it so much here on Chapters. Well, that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters. Please come again next time, and in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.